Hi, Landry Etheridge here with Etheridge Counseling Group, here to talk about trauma therapies, all the different kinds, pros and cons. There are a lot of different therapy modalities out there. If you're a newer client, newer to therapy, I don't think you need to feel overwhelmed about learning all the different types of therapy because any good therapist is going to seamlessly move in between, back and forth through various therapy modalities, depending on what you might need in a particular session, or even what you might need in a particular moment of a session. And I think being, um, not that I'm into gatekeeping, but if you are overly aware of therapy modalities, it can take you out of the moment and out of your body, and you start thinking too much in therapy. And that's kind of the opposite of what's going to be helpful for you. It's better for you to sort of sit back and kind of let the therapist do the therapist work, and you be more dialed into what's happening in your internally, your emotions. You're being objectively aware of your thoughts, perhaps aware of different parts of you that might be coming up. Physical sensations, being more attuned to your own body. But I will say it is really interesting and fun to learn about different therapy modalities. And if you know you really love something, if you've done something with a therapist and you're like, oh, that makes so much sense to me, it can be helpful if you're looking for a new therapist to know, like, oh yeah, I want an IFS therapist, or I love EMDR. I'd love to do more EMDR. So that can be helpful and interesting. So when I'm working with a client who has trauma, which to be honest is most clients, most of us have experienced some sort of trauma. We may not really think of it as trauma, but what I think of as trauma is basically a negative experience from our past that affect us not only in the moment, but subsequently and on through our future, which is true of most of us. But you might want to differentiate between big T trauma, which might be like a life-threatening experience, or a perceived life-threatening experience, and little T trauma, which would be more of these maybe smaller experiences, or maybe more frequent experiences of like neglect or emotional inattunement with our caregiver, something like that. But in terms of trauma modalities, trauma therapies, um, some of my favorites across the board. I love psychoeducation. That's less a therapy modality or a therapy, like a theory, a particular theory, and more of just sort of something that I have found really helpful in my own life. And my clients have also experienced how empowering it is to understand what's going on. So psychoeducation just means I'm learning. This is sort of left brain, analytical, logical. I'm learning about how the brain works. I'm learning about how my nervous system works. I'm learning how my nervous system is set up to protect me, to keep me safe. And that's why I'm here today, is because my nervous system is doing its job. It may not always feel good, like when maybe our nervous system sort of misreads a situation and we have a panic attack. Certainly not fun, but it's really helpful, I think, to understand the sort of the science behind it, the neuroscience behind it. Or psychoeducation can also just be learning about like how our family history affects us. So it's sort of that learning piece that I personally have found so helpful in my personal life and also professionally with clients. So that's a big thing for me. Another one is it's called IFS. It stands for Internal Family Systems, which is sort of a weird name, Internal Family Systems. It doesn't really make much sense on the surface, but it's really this idea that we have different parts of us that operate in different ways for the good of the system, basically for the good of me as a whole human. I have different parts of it. Just like I have different physical parts. I have lungs, I have shoulders, I have eyes, these different parts all kind of work together cohesively. Emotionally, mentally, we also have different parts of us. So you can kind of think about, what's the part of me that shows up when I'm at work? What's the part of me that shows up when I'm playing with my dog or my child? What's the part of me that when I'm, feeling um, in love, what's that part of me that shows up there? So that's sort of the easy explanation of internal family systems that can be really make a lot of sense for people who have had trauma, particularly who have had extensive trauma throughout their lives, especially early on. A lot of people are already thinking in this kind of language, so IFS can feel really sort of natural for people who've experienced developmental trauma. Another approach, of course, would be EMDR. That's something that we use at Etheridge Counseling Group. EMDR is an interesting therapy modality. It's really kind of different from a lot of them in that it incorporates eye movement. So, long story short, this is a very simplified version of what EMDR is. There's a lot of different phases of EMDR, but the one that is sort of like known for the most is basically you're thinking or mentally processing the negative experience, and as you're processing, partially internally, partially verbally, you're moving your eyes, and your therapist will help you do this either through following her fingers. This is not hypnosis, by the way. Moving her fingers, or you can even hold something that vibrates back and forth. The idea is that you're getting bilateral, meaning right, left stimulation, bilateral stimulation. So either through vibrating little paddles that just sort of gently vibrate back and forth. You can even do tapping back and forth, or most notably the eye movement, which is, I believe, research is showing that that is the most effective form, but not everybody that's comfortable for them. So you have these other options as well. Another favorite that a lot of therapists I've met don't really kind of work with this modality, but I found it pretty powerful. It's called schema therapy. It was developed by oh goodness, what's his name? Jeffrey Young. Jeffrey Young developed this schema therapy. The idea is a schema develops in early childhood. It's a quote unquote maladaptive core belief. For example, there's 18 different schemas that you might have, and a lot of people have two that they rank pretty high on. They usually have about two that I've, from my experience, most of us have two that are a little higher than the rest. And I find it to be helpful to focus on just one or two. If you kind of after taking the assessment that you see, you may have several. A lot of us have several, but the schema is developed in early childhood. It's a core belief. So, for example, maybe my core belief is maybe I have a failure schema, and so that's the idea of no matter what I do, I'm going to see myself as a failure. Now we can react to our schema in a few different ways. So we can either act in alignment with our schema. So if I'm a failure, then that means I'm not going to go for that job. I'm not going to go on that date. I'm not going to put myself out there because I know in my core that no matter what I do, I'm going to fail. So why try? So we can respond to our schema in that way, or we can respond in an opposite way, which is also just as maladaptive, can be just as maladaptive. Both of them are. And that would be I move into perfectionism because I have to be perfect, because otherwise, if I mess up, then my greatest fear has come true, being I am a failure. So it can, and there's some other ways that we can respond to our schemas, but that would be an example of how the failure schema might play out in somebody's lives. So taking the assessment, taking the questionnaire, figuring out what your schemas are is so empowering, because then this is my core wound and I can be aware of it. And I can also differentiate between fear or intuition versus my schema has been activated. And if I know that my schema has been activated, then I can think a little bit more clearly and understand, that's just my schema talking. I know that comes up. I know how to deal with that. I'm going to move it to the side and keep moving forward in a gentle, self-compassionate way. So those are a few, but I have written a blog post about 12 of my favorite therapy. It's trauma-informed therapies. So you can check that out on the blog and let me know what you think.